Good afternoon. This is Travis Marker, and I'm with Stewart Growth. And this is America Francis. She's also with Stewart Growth. She's the director. Today, we're starting our first session of a readers book club. And the focus of this book club versus other book clubs is that I've attended many book clubs and I love them. And I'm not in any way disparaging book clubs, but I often found that I felt if you're a reader and you enjoy reading, sometimes it's hard to stay on just one book. And so, um, and I love reading. I'm over 200 books for the year so far. So I usually clear a lot of books in a month. And so this is kind of a clearinghouse where we can meet and just talk about books that we're reading. Um, we are going to have some themes, I guess. And today's theme is why fiction? Why should we read fiction? Why is it relevant? What's important about fiction? And so we're going to open that up and just start exploring. Other people may join as we're going, which is totally great. And we'll see how things progress.
Can you make a quick plug for Scrivener's Quill too?
Sure. So for many years, I presented seminars to lawyers relating to literature and the law, and I started that series in October of 2011, and it was very fun to create the series, and it went for many years live, and then COVID hit, and other events happened, and so we've now adjusted the model so that it's by Zoom, and that is the first Thursday of each month at 10 o'clock Mountain Time. Uh, the series for October is going to be some lawyers speaking about Abraham Lincoln and the law. And so that should be very fun for lawyers who want credit. It is available for CLE credit, for continuing education credit. For those who just want to join, you're also able to do that. All right. So why fiction? Um, we could start a little bit because America and I've already been having this conversation. Um, Sometimes it's not easy to get into fiction, or sometimes it doesn't seem as maybe productive as nonfiction or as self-help books, or because sometimes you have to actually pay attention to the plot, or sometimes you have to worry about the characters, or depending on what's happening, it's just escapism and maybe it's not worth very much. It's just entertainment value. So I'll explore some of the things that I like about fiction, but maybe America, you set the other side of the table. What are your thoughts on fiction?
So I'm wondering if I'm in the great minority because maybe there are people who aren't big readers that need why should I read in the first place? And then there's probably a big group that says, why should I read any nonfiction? I'm assuming that a lot of people are more comfortable reading fiction or more interested in fiction than the other alternatives.
Okay, and I actually don't know what the percentages might be. For me, I guess the primary thing that I like about it was um, I was not necessarily a huge reader in high school because I was a jock and jocks were cool and jocks didn't read. But then I did go on an LDS mission, and to upstate New York, and I enjoyed studying and learning, and I did get into religious education, and I found it very fascinating to study, and I started to learn to study. And then I went to college at Weber State, and Mike Voss and Brad Rogar were two of my professors who had a tremendous impact on me, and they were definitely cool guys. Like these were people who are rock climbers, mountain climbers, very active. They were environmentalists, but they were also poets, and they were essayists, and they were published, and they were high advocates of literature. And so I
And they
thought,
were
wow,
men.
and they were men. Yeah. So I had these role models that also I was like, wow, this is not sissy stuff anymore. Like this is not just for ladies. And I was introduced to quite a few rugged poets and environmentalists that were, literature people. And I'm not necessarily focusing on the environmentalists because that's super significant or that's my philosophy. The idea was, but these were rugged people like John Muir. They were also Edward Abbey, a lot of the British individuals, like William Wordsworth. Some of these people would walk 60 miles in a day. And then there was um, the transcendentalists of of New England. Like Tom Emerson and Thoreau and others. And so like men were definitely involved in the process of writing, and so I did also kind of go, wow, I can change my paradigm.
It's
And
linking the physical with the mental.
yeah, but
And
they
also
really,
that artistic, so emotional too.
yeah, and so all of a sudden I realized there was value in fiction, but it wasn't just that they were writing things that were potentially not true, like fiction is not true. The idea was that they were able to gather through characters super powerful ideas that they would conceptualize in the things these people were saying. And so it wasn't that they were using the characters to just tell stories. They were using the characters to share thoughts and ideas and philosophies and tragedy and triumph
The
and
Tao of Pooh.
yeah. So the Tao of Pooh, like the idea is that through metaphor and through analogy and through narrative, you're able to tell human truths that you would not otherwise be able to experience. And this was very true of a lot of the 1860s, 1800s literature, like in Russia, England, France. Like, so you have the Count of Monte Cristo, which is a super
Love
powerful
that book.
story on, kind of revenge and maybe how far revenge can go. But then you have a lot of Russian stuff that's pretty powerful. The Tale
Love
of
the
Two
Russians.
Cities is great, Charles Dickens. But you're
Mhm.
also having people telling stories that were at the time of like social revolution, right? So because prior to the 1800s, we had divided classes, and also we have this class starting to come out, which is just like the common people who are able to not necessarily stay inside class structure, but in the United States, particularly, we were definitely doing away with the classes. The idea that there's definitely rich and definitely poor. We're creating middle class people, and now workers are very relevant.
Mhm.
And a lot of stories and literature and narratives are coming out of these workers movements that you see in a lot of literature. So I had this tremendous powerful moment where I'm like, man, these people are not just talking. Like these stories are they're relevant because they're sharing struggle. They're sharing a lot of things that are tremendously powerful, and you don't have to necessarily worth listen to every word because you're perceiving, like you're kind of receiving the struggle, and you're receiving the narrative that you're like, wow, this is pretty powerful stuff. um and so what was then an interesting thing was one of the prophets in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was David O. McKay, and he called a lot of these authors minor minor prophets, meaning that they were people who were providing revelation
Hmm.
to through their writing about life, right? And one of the fundamental concepts in kind of Mormon doctrine is the idea of perpetual revelation, but also the idea of um, there is a gigantic circle of truth that is not necessarily um, found in just, it's like an eternal truth. Like there's truths everywhere. And the fact was these truths were showing up in fiction, a lot of great fiction. Like you definitely read it and you're like, yeah, that is true.
They're all connected and they all relate. They're part of one big whole.
Yeah, exactly. And like when you get into people, for example, like John Steinbeck, I think I consider him like a secular prophet because some of the stuff he says inside his books are so profound that even though there's part of tragedy, like you don't just read these books because you're gonna feel good and feel safe and nothing bad's gonna happen. Like you have to read books where bad stuff happens so that the good stuff can happen. And you can go, oh my gosh, like that is so sad, but the lesson is also so impressed upon your brain that you're like, wow.
So I have two comments about that.
Yeah.
One is you brought up that really interesting idea about these profound thinkers and being naturalists or out in nature. And I think it does make sense that people who are spending a lot of time outdoors or, just really getting into the wild and nature, that those people will connect with some deep thoughts because they have the time and they're reflecting. So there's the nature piece of that. And then I just lost the other one. We'll have to get back.
Okay, no problem. But I think you're correct that I saw that most of these people were doing things that were stimulating inspiration. And
Mhm.
so even as I continued to read and explore ideas and thoughts, I eventually got into some of the ancient philosophers like Socrates and Plato. And one of the dialogues of Plato, where Socrates plays a role, is Ion, in which he talks about the power of inspiration and intuition. And and so when you start to see that people are writing, not just, it's not just a narrative, like that's not true. Like these are powerful things that happen. So then you have the question like, well, at what point does it become valuable fiction and valuable literature? This came up with Judge Gordon Lowe, who was a judge in Cache Valley for many, many years. Very powerful judge, very great guy. And he presented a continuing education series lecture on why lawyers need fiction. And his comment was all law and most legislation, most like anything that engages people probably originated in a story. And when you read quality fiction and good writing and writing that makes you think, you're reading about the engagement of human commerce. And human commerce is what lawyers advocate with when they go to court, is they're telling stories that resonate to the juries or to their clients or to the judge or to the other side. And so if you are immersed in the process of human commerce via narratives that connect, i.e., story, then you're able to help understand the mechanics of human connection and human commerce through that process. Because, like, for example, a predominant lawyer, Clarence Darrow, had a gigantic reading list. Like, he read lots and lots of books. Abraham Lincoln, again, lots and lots of books. Most of the founding fathers, lots and lots of books. And they used the human commerce that comes out of those books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or essays, to tell the stories that will make people move and decide in their favor. This is how, so like when somebody like Moms Against Drunk Driving, it's not just moms against drunk driving, it's moms telling their story about tragedies that connected to drunk driving. And they're not necessarily true, because like a person's human experience is their experience. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily true, but it is a narrative that is connecting us to their process or to their experience. Even if it's not true, it's still what they experienced.
Yeah, well, it does make sense that if you want to understand human relationships, you'll look at as many perspectives as possible. So if you want to understand how to influence your jury or the judge or whatever, if you consider all of these different stories, what's important to people, the motives, all of the interests, all of these things, then it would make you a better persuader and a better, it would just help you in that type of work. Sure. I am really interested in two words that you've used recently, because I was recently looking at personality profiles, and you said perceiving and you also said intuition. And I think that something we have in common could be that we use intuition and perception. So ENTP or EN, you're probably an I, actually, but the intuition and perceiving are ways of relating in the world. And so I thought it was really interesting that you brought those words up when talking about these stories, the way that you look at the world.
Exactly. Well, I totally do. And one of the things that ruined me was going to law school because you began to see everything in elements. And
What's an
so,
element?
so for example, in order to commit a crime, it has elements. So a burglary is the breaking and entering of a car or dwelling or space
Okay.
with the intent to commit a felony therein. So that was the initial, those are the initial elements of burglary.
Why
So
does
you,
that ruin you?
because now anytime you're hearing a story, you start to hear elements of the law to say like like a contract has elements. There has to be an offer, an acceptance, some bargain for exchange, a consideration has to be exchanged between the parties, and they have to then perform. So if all those things don't happen, you may not have a contract.
Those formulas sound so useful.
Well, they are very useful. And so what'll happen is like when you hear Charles Dickens talk about Ebenezer Scrooge and his different contracts, it's interesting. He'll say it's not my business. And the ghost responds, mankind is your business. The common welfare is your business. Charity, mercy, forbearance is your business. So the ghost is not just saying what Scrooge's business is like, you should just know. He's actually giving him the elements of what his business is. Like his contract with humanity includes charity, mercy, forbearance, because he's a member of the human contract, right? The human race. And so it's like that's an element of like a social contract, which is super fun. So then, you have elements of what is about motive, because a motive is a thing that it causes a person to act. And so, like, I love reading Ray Bradbury in the fall, and you talk about something wicked this way comes, and the boys, are you know Jim and I can't remember the guy, or Nightshade, and then the other kid. But they do things like, what's their motive for why they're fighting, the October people who come in the circus and are, engaging. So have you not read Something Wicked This Way Comes? Very, very fun October book. I don't know if it might be a little bit scary for smaller kids, but for teenagers and middle school and teenage, great book because the characters in that book are kind of later. They're like probably sixth graders on. But the problem is the adults are the ones who are susceptible to the problems because the October people in the circus come and they're taking advantage of the adults. And the kids are a little bit able to resist because they don't have the same propensities as the adults. But there's a problem with Jim Nightshade is he wants to be an adult. And so he is subject to these October people, right? But the question that comes up is that Ray Bradbury is able to identify and work through the motives of why people become vulnerable to tragedy or why they become vulnerable to success or why they become vulnerable to whatever. So again, you're not just reading a story, you're hearing about motive.
That's a
And
really interesting way to put that. Vulnerable to success. I'd like more about that.
yeah, well, it's again the propensities, right? Like what are the obstacles that are preventing you from, or what are the things that are out there? And so Judge Lowe, coming back to him, he talked about great lawyers read great books. And he said in his own and he had a whole bunch of lists of books. He said in his own life, he generally doesn't read books that are less than 100 years old. Um, I think he broke that rule a couple of times because at that point, Steinbeck wasn't, his books were not quite 100 years old. But the idea is you have to read books that are powerful, right? I don't think that you necessarily have to read books that are 100 years old because I think there's a lot of great writing out
I wouldn't want that rule.
there. And I found that even escape literature, like literature that's not necessarily written um, with the intents of being profound, still has value in it and still has a lot of stuff that's really creative and really clever. And even those authors often have huge reading lists themselves. Like they, even though they're writing stuff that might be just for fun, they still themselves have a backdrop of reading and they'll put that
Travis, when are you going to
thinking.
write your book?
I have no idea. But
Soon.
one of the things that happened though is I did write in college and I had a personal essay published and it became part of I felt like part of the process, like I was inside the circle because I was I had kind of I had written, I had read, I had thought, I had written, and it was worth value enough that somebody published it.
I just want to get you a microphone and have you, instead of reading a book every day, have you spin your thoughts on some topics and stick them in a book. You've read enough now. It's time for you to share
Well,
some thoughts.
that's also what we're doing right now, right?
Is what we're doing.
And it's fun because we like it's not like you also are adding to the conversation, right? Everybody can add to that conversation and could write it down. Like you could write it down.
Write it down. I actually started my book the other day. I put a document together and I outlined the chapters. So
Very good. Now, one of the realities is like, is everything you're going to write true?
that sounds like a very high standard, especially for someone who has expectations of truth like you. Like, who's going to say that it's true, Travis?
Well, you can just embrace that it's not true.
Well, I don't know that I could write a book that was completely true, but I would want it to be valuable.
Exactly. Well, that's the question, right? Is when you start writing, even everybody who starts writing, the question is why would somebody read this, right? And so fiction, the question isn't is it true, but Ernest Hemingway made the comment: if you want it to be valuable, even if it's nonfiction, the person reading it must believe it's true. So when you read non fiction that connects with you, there must be something in that fiction that you're like, I love this because I'm identifying with this character. I think this character is reasonable. I think this character is approachable. I think this character is practical. Even if they're faulty characters, they
You're
still have
very persuasive. Now I'm thinking about all the ways I can make my book a fiction book.
but even still, there's like these marriages that take place in writing. So like when Truman Capote wrote In Cold Blood, he had over 3,000 pages of notes about the truthful situation that happened. So there was this horrible murder in Kansas, and he's super fascinated by it because it had nothing to do with anything other than these people wanted to kill some people. So that's the in cold blood part. But he wanted to understand that because there wasn't necessarily a reason to kill these people. Like there was some information that they might have had some resources or money, but generally speaking, they could have just done a burglary and stole the money or whatever, right? Like he needed to understand, like, why did these people need to die? So he went to the town and researched and researched and researched all this true information so that he could create a factual foundation for the book. But then he had to actually tell the story. And as soon as people start making up dialogue inside a true book, it's made up. So
Yeah.
as soon as somebody talks and they're saying, well, Joe said the following, or there's a narrative, that's not true. But the reality is in order even to tell a true story in a biography or in an autobiography or a memoir, you start to make up the dialogue that should have been there so that it connects.
How could you possibly present something as true? Everybody is getting the information from a different perspective. There's no one true narrative.
That's true. So now the reality is why fiction? Well, because most stuff is probably a little bit fiction. Even the most factual,
Colored by your perception.
absolutely, it's coming through the narrative of the biographer. It's coming through the narrative of the writer. It's coming. So they're writing through their experience of the information presented. So even though Truman Capote gets 3,000 pages of notes, Truman Capote still tells the story through his filter of the experience, of the facts, of the whatever. And
Mhm.
so it's not necessarily perfectly true. That's why you can have um, who knows how many biographies there are of Abraham Lincoln or of George Washington or whatever, is that there isn't a complete, a full encompassing uh, database of all the stuff on them. So all of a sudden there's a new journal or there's a new fact or there's a new perspective because now they're going to write through the Battle of Saratoga. They're going to write through the Battle of um, crossing the Delaware or whatever. And all the data that came from that experience through the human narratives has to be fact checked enough that people go, are these narratives reliable? So now we have a burgeoning database of fiction books that say, um, have you seen the categories unreliable narrators? So if you go to Libby, which is a great plug for everybody, if you want a great database for audiobooks that's connected most likely to your state library, go to LIBBY. And if you have a library card, you can get into this database. But they have a category called unreliable narrators. And what it means is the person telling the story is not reliable. So even though
But
you
who is the one that's saying that person is unreliable? Because that person also has biases.
absolutely. So when you look at the girl on the train, like this is a fiction book that came out a while ago, and is a movie. The narrator is telling the story through her alcoholism. But the tragedy of the story is that even through her alcoholism, she saw it correctly. But she becomes unreliable to those around her because she's an alcoholic. And now she's also in a domestic violence situation where there's gaslighting and domestic violence and everything happening. So it's not necessarily that she is completely unreliable. It's just that she doesn't fit into the categories in society that would say she should be reliable. So in order for her to solve the mystery and the crime and to bring out this, the murderer, she has to be true to herself and her addiction and her process and her experiences in domestic violence so that she can come out. Like she has to be persistent in her recovery, right? So even though she's a tragic hero, she's also like kind of noble because she has to recognize in her situation her value. Where you look at the book Gone Girl, is that the book? Is that what it's called? You have an apparent domestic violence situation in which the the victim, the apparent victim, is not a victim. She she has like tremendous psychological issues. But then you also get a picture of the dynamics between the husband and the wife, or I don't even know if they're married, but they also a kid shows up, and you have the question of what will a person do in order to be near a child, even though the situation is horrifically dysfunctional. So the parties involved are unreliable because of the dysfunctional system and the facts presented and the crimes presented. But then there's society's perspective again of what is happening and which of the people involved is going to be reliable by way of who do we help in this situation.
I think one thing that's really useful as a mediator is just to right up front understand that you can't understand it.
Yep.
There is just way too much information. There way too many events. You just won't understand. And that's okay. You can do the process without really getting it because they get it. And you're here in the present working on solutions that are defined. Because if you try and unravel that kind of a snarl, it just gets more confusing.
Yeah, but what's even better is that you just tell the parties you don't believe them from the beginning. Because it
Differently, but yes.
no, I often do this because both parties in a case, whether it's my client or whether I'm mediating between two parties or multiple parties, they will say the other party is lying. Like
Yes.
this often comes up. This is one of the very first things people say. And I also sit as a judge in Davis County, and people will say the other side is lying. And I will in court, I will in mediation, I will to my clients say, it doesn't matter. Everybody is lying, not because they're not telling the truth, but because they're sharing a perspective that the other side doesn't believe is true.
They have to advocate for themselves.
Yeah. So I'll say, rather than say people are lying, let's say, what can we understand about their perspective, which is different than yours? Because if we understand that difference, then we'll probably understand why you haven't settled.
Yes.
And so, but what's fun is that because I'm not buying into the idea that anybody's telling the truth, they don't have to convince me.
Right.
And you shared the idea of collaborative dispute resolution the other day. You know, the idea of how do we do collaborative conflict resolution or collaborative conflict management. Well, you become collaborative when you don't have to own your story as true, when you can say, this is my impression of what I experienced, which is valid, right? And everybody's experience is valid. Their narrative is valid. It might be self-serving, it might be self-protective, it might be whatever, because most narratives are initially. So how do we have the safety to come out of that and then start working on solutions? Well, you see the ways to work through that in fiction, because a lot like Sherlock Holmes will say, I don't do anything, I don't create any theories until I have enough data. So Sherlock Holmes is openly identifying the vulnerability with hearing narratives and believing they're true.
Well,
They're,
if you have a polarized system where you only have black and white, then any answer you get is wrong. You have to get the full picture.
correct. And so then you'll start to add pieces into the story. So just like Truman Capote writing, he has 3,000 pages. He realizes in the story there needs to be a discussion about this. And whatever this is, it's the thing that's critical to bridging the gap between what happened and what was supposed to happen, or what happened and what the parties were planning, or what happened and what people just reading it need to cognitively cross the bridge, right? And so I'll identify that to parties in mediation, to my clients, to in the judge. I'll say, you've told me a story that sounds like this. What's not helping me is why that would have happened, or what about the missing piece, or like what about the gun on the mantle that like you mentioned in chapter 5, because you mentioned the gun, and so it is important or is it not important? And so I'll tell my clients, like in a criminal case, the police report says the following things happen. Did the following things happen? They'll say yes, but they didn't understand the following other stuff. I'm like, okay, so you have additional data that you can add into your story that helps me get context for why you feel I should defend you, or why this you should be, whatever should happen. But asking the question, what is I'm missing context about why this is important to me, that shows up in literature all the time, because they're in essence showing you this is plot scenario, this is story construction, this is, and we are conditioned to say I'm missing these pieces of the story.
One thing that could be useful for the people watching this is to know that you studied English and history in college. So you know how all of these things break down.
But I'll also confess I didn't get it. In my degree, I learned to like it. And, I could write papers on, Rudyard Kipling or on, whoever. I also like nihilists. So like I wrote papers on Russian nihilism. But I think that the thing that you get in college is you just get exposure. And so exposure to history and exposure to literature doesn't necessarily, it doesn't show you why it's relevant, because I've worked with professors who are experts on Locke or Thoreau or on Jane Austen or Maya Angelou, but sometimes they also create like this box that is like that's all they can think about, and everything has to reference off of their subject matter, and so they're kind of losing the cross-pollinating value or the collaborative value of just staying super open about everything you read. And Ray Bradbury, in his book Zen and the Art of Writing, talks about if you're not reading, like if you go to a laundromat and there's a popular science magazine sitting there, he says you should read it because it gives you context, it gives you substance, it gives you the ability to explore a character through the thing you're learning about this other thing, right? This other.
How your brain handles so much information.
Well, no,
like
you keep
how
going.
do you remember it? How do you use it? It just seems like you've forgotten so many things, more information than people have ever even considered. Just that many books.
There's truth to that, but the point is that when you're because we just read the Starfish book, The Spider and the Starfish, very valuable.
That was a good book.
Very valuable, nonfiction. However, they taught you all the lessons by sharing stories about companies or products or processes that evidence their theory, right? Because they're showing the theory of the spider versus the starfish, which is an analogy, which is fiction.
Well, you've got to have that to remember it. So a lot of nonfiction has the fiction. I think
Absolutely.
That's what you're saying is, why should you read fiction? Well, there's fiction in every book, right?
You're already reading it, right? You have to understand that it's helping impress upon you the narrative, right? It's helping impress upon you the lesson. Yes. So if we come back to the starfish, they talk about the catalyst. The catalyst often shares a story that starts a thing.
What is it called? The starfish and the spider?
Yeah, the spider and the starfish.
Yeah, I want to make sure that people can find the book and we don't just reference it generically where they can't find it after we talk about it.
Right. But the catalyst often is the story person, and the story is made through connections and collaboration, so that you're stimulated. The catalyst is stimulating things through a variety of stories to say, oh, this is like this, and this is like this, and this is like this, and this is like this. And in that collaboration of data, you then pass the narrative to the person who's the implementer. And I can't remember who's the implementer called. Anyway, there's the person who creates the foundation with the collaboration. I can't remember the name of that person. So here's an example, but I can't remember. So and sometimes I lose words, so it's great. But like Wozniak, for example, Steve Jobs has Wozniak. Wozniak is the person who creates foundation. Steve Jobs says, I have an idea that there's something like this that could work out. I would like this to be this. And Wozniak, I think you have the expertise and the information that could create this from my idea. But because Steve Jobs has enough intellectual, IP capital in the subject matter, he's able to understand that there are components that can adapt. He just has to be able to share that story in a way that's convincing enough or programmable enough to Wozniak that Wozniak can then manifest the thing, right?
The translator.
Yeah, so there's the difference between the catalyst and the implementer.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But you still need to be able to share in a way that makes sense that data in a story format, because people have to get how it connects to them. Like, why would they do this? So I think it's fascinating. So once I understood from Judge Lowe that I needed to read books for the purpose of being able to communicate, it dramatically changed the way I read books. So now I do read lots and lots of books, but I don't and I don't necessarily just read them for what's in the book. I'm thinking about the elements of the story by way of why is it fun? Why is it connecting? Why is it interesting? What are the different crafts that are happening inside it that make it interesting?
Now I want to read your ebook on how to find elements. What are the elements that are important to look at or interesting to look at?
Yeah. Well, and I think the question is you don't always know. So that's why you have to think about what you read, um, because you'll think to yourself, why was that story even fun? Like, why was that story exciting? And sometimes it comes from the reviews you read. Like Jack Reacher's a book series I love to read because there's not anything like you can't really quote Lee Child when he writes. So if you here's another plug for a I my book reading app is Goodreads. And if you go to goodreads.com, this is where you can upload all the books. My profile is Scrivener's Quill, and therefore you can see all the books I've read.
And go to it because it has so many good books on it.
But you'll notice that there's very few quotes that come out of Lee Child's books because he doesn't necessarily share with you quotable material. Like it's not like it's not profound that way. But what he does do is he provides you this tremendously educated former Marine uh, investigator who was investigating a cop before he retires, and he's 6'5", and he's 250 pounds of like muscle, and because he understands the system is broken, he implements the law. and it's tremendously, it goes back to the Wild West stuff, like how does the West get solved? Well, usually somebody comes in like John Wayne or somebody else and fixes the problem and reestablishes the equilibrium. You got a comment?
I want to hear how you decide which books to read next because you consume books so fast. Like, how do you pick from all of the options what you'll focus on next?
Okay, so sometimes I'll find a series. Like currently I've found the Longmire series that it's on Netflix, but the books are super fun. I haven't watched any of the Longmire series, but the books are just tremendously interesting, tremendously fun. And so I might I'll keep in my queue one of those books because like I think the series has like 25 books or something.
Longmire?
Yeah, Longmire, Lingmire. And the author is Craig Johnson. So I'll say I'd like to get through that series, but I don't want to necessarily read it straight through. So I'll just add, one of those in. I also have nonfiction that I'm exploring. So in the morning I'll listen to segments of three. Right now I'm listening to segments of three nonfiction books that relate to like currently it's couple dynamics. And so I'm listening to Wired for Love. I think another one's called Consciously Loving. Another one is I Love You, but I Don't Trust You. I think it's something like that. I don't know. But some of that is relevant to the work we do as steward growth by way of how people overcome like codependency and stuff of that nature. I also have been in therapy myself just because I was in a car accident in 2019 and have benefited from learning about myself. And so I find those books relevant by way of just how to overcome my own codependency issues by way of life and variety of things that have happened. And it's benefiting my marriage. So my wife's grateful I'm studying and my family benefits. So I have nonfiction I add in. I have fiction that I add in. The fiction I add in because again, it helps. It's a different form of learning in that you're not like I don't have to listen to all the elements. I listen to the story and then I can think about it. I can think about why it's working. But I'm not necessarily I'm not where sometimes nonfiction or self-help books are more textbook books sometimes. So you're learning differently. I do not often have nonfiction books that are just like biographies. I might do more autobiographies. But I'll look for things that I guess just are interesting at the moment. Like if I'm going to Arizona, I might look for an Edward Abbey book. If or if I'm going out to the middle of nowhere, like I might look for a Western, just because it's relevant to the setting, and sometimes you connect with the setting. I like psychological thrillers or books that play around with your brain. So I might pick a sci-fi book or a a murder mystery suspense thriller book, and they're definitely not all the same. But I've enjoyed Aloysius Pendergast, who's a detective created by Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child.
Man, I don't know how to spell that word.
Yeah, it's French, but if you look up Detective Pendergast, if you just
Not
Google detective,
important.
if Google Detective Pendergast,
Okay.
you'll come up with the series. And there, what's interesting is that every one of his books has something macabre in it, but
Okay.
it's not necessarily scary. Like when you read Stephen King, oftentimes there's something that's just like there's scary stuff in his books, like where like there's the creeping in the night and you're freaking out because you're like, I just don't know if I can process this book. Something bad is going to happen. Where Aloysius Pendergast, his books already have something macabre has already happened.
I think you should define that word for those of us that may not know. I mean, I've heard of it, but let's help out
Okay,
the other people who don't read 200 books a year.
okay, so macabre is like Dracula morbid, like there's usually something gruesome or morbid or grotesque, like it's dark.
Okay.
So like in one book, like thousands of feet are washing up onto the shore inside the shoes.
Yeah.
So somebody or something or something has happened where people cut off, like they lost their foot in their shoe. It was cut off with their foot in their shoe, right? And it's washing onto a beach. So you're kind of like that's that's gruesome, like that's awkward. But they're not overly descriptive to the point that you can't handle it. Like you're just kind of like, yep, that is macabre. I got
Okay.
the,
Thank you.
but it's not it doesn't keep repeating over and over again where you're like beat down by like, like I'm gonna throw up because like I keep experiencing. You just know that it happened and you process the rest of the detective story as he tries to figure out why that happened.
Is that also French?
Macabre, that
I know
word.
it's spelled funny.
Yeah, I think some places say macabre. So if you dance the macabre, uh, or I guess it could be pronounced macabre or macabre, but it's the skeleton dance. And so
Oh.
I have no idea exactly the origin, but it could be definitely French.
I just want to make sure that people who watch this feel like they can connect and it's not over their head.
I would hope it's not over anybody's head.
You have a very good vocabulary.
But I would also say is we're coming on to fall, and so as we're kind of wrapping up this hour, I did recommend to America a book series by Richard Peck, which is the Grandma Dowdle series. This is um Grandma Dowdle is a wonderful old woman in kind of southern Illinois, and she's a law unto herself in this small town,
Hmm.
and she helps um, fix the equilibrium of the town. And she has some tremendously fun ways that she does it. It also, I love cooking. and in her books, there's often a variety of cooking that happens, and she has grandkids, and she's like her grandkids as well as children become the beneficiaries of her kindness. So these are middle school and young. They're kind of like elementary school, middle school reading books. Like this would be the age that her books. What is it called? A Long Way from Chicago was the first one, and it's a Newbery winner.
Oh,
And so the two books that follow, I think, might have been Newbery honors, but they're just super fun.
my mom used to pay us $1 a Newbery book.
Okay.
So we read a lot of Newbery books at our house.
Yeah, well, the Newbery books they're really good, and they have tremendous value because they are being shared with youth, but they often have adult value. I have presented on Grandma Dowdle in lawyer Seeley's, and the lawyers were definitely enchanted with them. Like they did like the books, so I would definitely recommend her for fall reading, and into Christmas because they do take place. They're kind of in the summer, but they also come into fall, and then there's one book is definitely comes into Christmas time, and so A Season of Gifts is a very excellent Christmas book.
What are you going to be cooking?
So I have been cooking because we've had an abundance of peaches and nectarines. We've been doing cobblers and crisps.
Mm.
I know that you've asked for nectarines, but there weren't any that were super impressive, but
Okay.
they're still edible.
Thank you for remembering.
Yeah, but I didn't pass you any nectarines because I we didn't thin enough because some years if you like if you thin then sometimes they you never know. But this year we should have definitely thinned because like with all the moisture we got, it was like overabundance of
Yeah.
everything.
Okay.
Um, so what topic should we maybe explore for next time? Like what would be our theme for next time?
Mm. That's a really good question. Reader's Book Club.
Maybe we'll do maybe we can do because it'll be October. We can do just Halloween or fall literature.
Don't even know about. Actually, I was remembering a book that I love called The Witch Who Saved Halloween. So there's my
Oh, okay.
Halloween contribution.
All right. I have not read that.
It's a good one. I don't know if I could even find it, but I that is a fine topic. I don't know that I have an hour to say about it, but I'm happy to listen to you and talk about whatever fall and Halloween ideas you come up with.
Well, I know that there is definitely a lot to talk about because if you think about the nature of like Sherlock Holmes books, a lot of them deal with metaphysical things or that appear to be metaphysical. A lot of the Aloysius Pendergast books are in the same category where you're doubting your senses because of what you're experiencing. Uh, the Dracula concept has some interesting things
Mm-hmm.
that are relevant. By why was the story told? What's its relevance? Also, Frankenstein has some good stuff.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So we'll explore some of that, and for October, we'll just kind of be Halloween and the macabre or whatever. We'll just play around with it. Also, Neil Gaiman, a great book for that it would be middle school readers again and elementary is The Graveyard Book.
Mm.
Very fun book to read. My kids and I we'll have to listen to that maybe every other year.
I have a book I don't have access to that one right now either, but it's like a cookbook for how to cook children or something.
Oh, okay. I don't have.
And then there's one about an apple pie that this ghost is trying to. Okay, I'm starting to get some percolation going on.
All right, you also have Ronald Dahl who has Matilda, uh, the uh, the giant peach. You know, I can't remember.
Which
Charlie,
is
which is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. There's a little bit of there's always the strange that's in a lot of doll stuff. That's kind of fun. All right,
awesome.
well We'll sign off and we'll see you guys next month.
Before we sign off, though, we should invite everyone who has any interest in participating in this conversation. Please sign on to our discussion because you can be involved in our discussion. It's not just a presentation. We'd love to include you.
Absolutely. Totally agree.